Hello, and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí. I'm Hank Hine, the museum director, and it's my pleasure to welcome two poets to our session today, Deborah Bogen and Lynn Emanuel. This program is hosted by Emeritus Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, Helen Pruitt Wallace, and is sponsored by the City of St. Petersburg. Please welcome Helen Pruitt Wallace, who will, as is our custom, read one of her poems before she introduces today's poets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hank, and thanks to all of you all for joining us tonight for the Dalí Poetry Series. We are delighted to have Lynn Emanuel and Deborah Bogen with us this evening. And we want to do a big thanks to Danny Lawless, who is the editor of Plume, who has put us in touch with Lynn and with Deborah. And I want to do a shout out for Plume 10, which is the print anthology. It's the 10th anniversary of the print anthology that's newly published. And 86 different poets and writers are in this anthology, including Deborah and Lynn. And I think we may be hearing their poems that are printed in the anthology. So welcome to them. And also a shout out to Danny, because I believe he has a new manuscript that's soon going to be published. So we're delighted about that. He's a fine poet in his own right. And yes, Hank, thank you. I will read one short poem. But before I do, I want to just mention that Hank is right that today, actually, the new poet laureate of St. Petersburg has been welcomed into this new role. Her name is Gloria Munoz, and Gloria is terrific. She'll be wonderful for our city, and congratulations to you, Gloria, and to the city for such a good choice in choosing Gloria. I'll read one short poem. This is to welcome fall. The title of the poem is also the first line. I pocket bones of a deer dropped beside an oak, a bulbous curve of hock, a few holed ribs, and love how a socket swallows what isn't there, the joint unjoined. Who was it planted the maples in perfect rows, straight as a firing line? And whose astonishing death, their red eruptions? First up, we have Deborah Bogen, and we are delighted to have Deborah with us. Deborah's books include 4 prize-winning collections of poetry, the latest of which is In Case of Sudden Freefall, published by Jacar Press in 2017. Her newest collection, Speak Now, This Charm, is forthcoming from Jacar. These days, she balances the poet's life with political responsibilities in Pittsburgh. Please welcome Deborah Bogen. So glad to have you with us, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Helen. See, I have a list of thank yous too, because I'm always terrified about that. But thank you to the Dalí Museum. It's been a great fun time for me exploring online your museum, and especially the Paul Eluard material, which sent me into Wikipedia mode. It was great. I'm also thankful to Danny Lawless for including me in the current Plume anthology, and especially to Lynn Emanuel for choosing to introduce one of the poems that I'm going to read for you today. So I do have a new book coming out, Speak Now This Charm. Speak Now This Charm is an Anglo-Saxon admonition, and I dabble in Anglo-Saxon stuff. And what I love about the charms is that there's a charm for every occasion in the Anglo-Saxon world. So if someone steals your cattle, there's a charm for that. If your child is afflicted with Waters Elf disease, there's a charm for that. If you need bees to come to your hive, there's a charm for that. In the past traumatic 3 or 4 years we've all been going through, not to mention life in general, I thought I need some charms to get me through these situations. Hence this book. I'm going to start right in with the first poem, Reticence. I went into the small room and took off all my clothes. The red sweater, the ink black slip, the creased and folded letter, even the memory of Agnes Martin's paintings. Then I waited, naked, in the cold, listening to the distant purr of someone's printer. I was lonely and shivering, but I still dreaded the knock on the door. It might be the man with the speculum or the man with the $100 bill. It might be the woman who measured my breasts, the one who recommended figure-flattering swimwear. It might even be that priest, the one with the dark gray eyes. He was always hungry for my secrets. Bodies. I've been thinking about your body and the box they put it in, wondering if you're still in there, if a hand under the lip of that box might be a way of climbing in, of being in there with you. Because once we were sisters, we thought our bodies eternal. And sweetheart, isn't that every girl's mistake? My hands ache to touch your face, to brush the bangs from your eyes. When they took you, when they closed the lid on the box, I wished I was a button on your blouse. I'm the mother of middle-aged women who are themselves the mother of grown children. So I've seen a lot of those relationships change over time, and they have to. There's a time when you know more about your children than they know about themselves, but you can't hang on to that. So this is a poem called What I Do Now. I get up early to investigate the needs of the day. I turn myself into a wall, a blank, a separate thing. I give up being the key that fits their locks. I embrace new strategies. Do not bargain, do not meddle, do not explain. Invisible rivers still flow between us, but I know they too have been granted a secret life. So I unlearn the way the one walks, the way her sister turns her head. About their hearts, I do not speak. Like apple trees, they have sunk roots into their own meadows. Therefore, joy. Also, this vague, disembodied grief. I must pack away my craving for their childish, vulgar laughter. So some people say Simonides was the first professional poet because we know he charged money for his poems. We don't know that about anyone else. And he did it by counting the letters in the poems, which were carved into stone because they were usually monuments. And he developed a system with red and black paint so that he could incorporate more information into a smaller space. And during the course of the beginning of the pandemic and the daily news, and even going back to Vietnam days when we used to sit at night and listen to Walter Cronkite, I thought of what a big deal counting has been. This is called counting. Disease meant confusion, but your death bells cut clean crescents in the sky. They organized my mind. I write your name down on a piece of paper and put it in my pocket so I can carry you around. The dream blood was your blood, a dark residue of loss. And I know death always wins, but you felt so necessary. Your breathing, the brackets I lived within. Each day I walk to your stone to lay my hand on the space of your name. Like Simonides, I count each letter. Always a bird is singing, sometimes red, sometimes black. See how strange it is, this windsail of going on. Sometimes I hear people discounting fairy tales and folklore, and even my own husband, I have a little thing about this. I'll get all involved in a TV story, and he'll say, "It's just a story, Deborah," and I'll say, "It's someone's story. It's this. These matter to us." So I was surprised one day when I found myself stuck reading about the Bermuda Triangle and feeling pretty dumb for reading about the Bermuda Triangle, and yet not quite able to stop reading about the Bermuda Triangle. Hence this poem, Fairy Tale. Somewhere Sargasso, the waves sigh, breathe water to those long past struggling, torpedo bombers, celebrities in seaplanes, even the Sulphur Queen's crew, all of them done in by forces unknown to science, disappeared in poorly charted waters. Do you think there was a warning, a low growl in the sailor's gut, or a buzzing at the back of the pilot's brain? Did the loosened cords in the throats of the drowned hail the newly doomed when at last the sea swallowed them? Of course not. This is just a story that none of us believe. Also, this is a story that all of us believe. I noticed in the past few years, I was always seem to be reading about the aftermath. So it was the aftermath of the shooting, it was the aftermath of the hurricane, it was the aftermath of the war. And I thought, now we all live in the aftermath all the time. We're in constant aftermath. So this is called After the Aftermath. I think of the ways we got it wrong, all the things we didn't know, who did it, and why, and where it was done, and how we can think about the Lord's Prayer as 13 ways of looking at a tragedy. There are scientific strategies for finding the bodies, radar that penetrates dirt, and signs left by scavenging insects. Sometimes the earth is disturbed, maybe a mound or a place where the soil is compacted. Sometimes we use dogs. It helps not at all. That loss is a thing as old as night. What I need is a way to build a shrine to the child not yet dead. So sometimes I read interviews about poets who knew they were going to be a poet when they were 6 or 7. And there's a story that goes with that. And I've always been envious because I was not that kid. I was the kid on a bicycle, or the kid playing kickball, or the kid laying in the grass counting ants. But when I was maybe 6 or 7, my parents took me along to the paint store when they were picking out paint. And I saw those cool long tabs with the colors. And I realized there was a grown-up somewhere in the world who had the job of naming those colors. That was the grown-up job. And I became obsessed with naming colors. This poem is called Colors. Blood red was all the rage that year in the fashion magazines and the furniture showrooms. So now we had the new love seat, my mother's find, the fabric called blood red. But it looked older and dried up, something closer to rust. The walls of my room were a perfect sky blue, and my bed was cotton ball white. I remember the morning Dad woke me early. He said, "I have to go." He said, "Don't believe what they'll tell you." He said, "And don't forget." So I never did. I dream it still, the rusty blood dream, the fire they kept showing on the news, and the car hanging off the cliff, smoking like a secret signal. I'm trying to watch the clock. I'm one of 3 sisters, and we were close, happy sisters, I guess you'd say. But I was the lucky one who got the body that was able to survive childhood, and my sisters didn't. just by bad luck, they didn't get that body. And I really never, you don't ever get over losing sisters, but I must say, I think it's pushed Lynn into an awkward position because I keep making her my poetry sister come hell or high water. Nevertheless, last year I read Lincoln in the Bardo, which is a book you probably know, George Saunders. The Bardo is a place between life and death. And there are people in the Bardo in their caskets who can't remember they're dead. They can't get used to the idea they're dead. So they keep trying to get out and do stuff and get put in their box. And I wrote this poem called Sisters. I'm the last sister standing, but tonight I mean to lay down, to practice being in the box. Tonight I want to move my mind around my sisters' girlish bodies, to find out what it's like to be in there with them, boxed up and put away. Tonight, I will surrender this busy pulse and accept their stagnant blood as mine. I will unclench my fist and let go of memory's balloon. Dear body, dear blood, do you think it's possible to prepare, to shutter my heart and stop looking at this world? This is a poem I wrote for Joseph Cornell, also a man obsessed with boxes. Communion. Cornell's art space escapes logic's cathedral. In his crypt, bird bones crumble, folios flake and fade. Ignoring the mind's upper reaches, those ornamental windows and showy buttresses, Cornell altered boxes, turning them into visible, breathing dreams. Mirrors, stamps, feathers, dolls, old suitcases, and older crates. His work creates a flood that fills your mouth until you are satiated, until you are nearly drowned. Feel that? You are inward now, inward and stilled, just as you were when you first tasted the sacrament. So another hero artist of mine is Marc Chagall, and that he's a hard guy to have as a hero if you learn a lot about Chagall, but I can't leave him alone. And he has this painting called The Falling Angel, which is dated from 1923 to 1947. And I kept thinking, how do you work on a painting that many years and through that time period? And I happened to be looking at a print of the painting on Remembrance Day, which is, of course, the day we remember Holocaust victims. And I got it. This is called Remembrance Day for Marc Chagall. I took the photo from the box and looked at what seemed to be a camp and 6 shapes near the edge of a forest. I was hunting details that told a story. Don't we all want the narrative? And those shadow-drenched shapes could be prisoners or soldiers or even small trees. As my eyes tired, the shapes seemed smudged. They wavered like smoke. Were they becoming angels? No, it wasn't that. But I think I understand now why Chagall kept reworking The Falling Angel. Versions of heaven give way to versions of hell, and then those are painted over by a personal, momentary bliss. This is not, I know, the official story, but it's the truth. When I can't sleep, I imagine my body as a box as a series of boxes. I imagine my body as a boxcar, a train stalled in the yard, each box requiring attention and unloading. There's a way to do this, a process I've read about in magazines. Still, I can't quiet the body's voice. If you must think of me, the body says, don't imagine me as the box your mind is. I don't have to be that haunted or hemmed in by our history. See how I breathe without thought, in and out, in and out. That's because I have a life of my own, a buoyancy that defies our circumstances. Your mind's like a late Rothko, but I'm like something painted by Matisse. I owe a lot to painters. Thank God there are painters. Oh, we do. Okay, so, and I can't paint. I actually got partly involved with Lynn, who you'll hear from next, because her dad's an amazing painter, or was an amazing painter too. This poem is called This Is How. I turned away and walked away. I walked away without looking back. I walked through the murmurs, the low rumblings of gossips. I walked to the edge of the world and looked into all that white. I stared at the white while they lowered you down. I stared at the white and the silence and the wild nothing. I closed my mind. I closed up. I became an anemone far from your waves. Already you were less than a memory, less than a muteness, not part of the looming vacuum, but so stupidly theatrical in your flapping white linens. Every day is the day of the dad. I mean, every day is the day of the dead. This is the poem that Plume was kind enough to take. I've seen, like you, movies and news things where they show air raids with these drones. And the creepy part, of course, is that some guy's working controls that look like a video game, but then they show the explosion. And then in the movies, they show people kind of being thrown, and then they just get up and they sort of dust themselves off and they begin speaking with each other. And I've even had a car wreck experience that lets me know that's not right. So I wanted to write a poem about that. And this is called Reconstructing the Crime. If you remember anything, it's the drone whine, that omen of conflagration and crumbling, of snakes gliding through rubble like new forms of water. Dust curtained the air, but there was no sound, just a void where there should have been roofs falling, bones breaking, bloodied bodies crying out. What a hell-shaped silence. The village dogs pantomimed barking. What you remember is your own fucked up focus, the way you sat, drone struck, stupid, the way your mind wouldn't work. Your mind became a river that slid snake-like out of that scene. You didn't notice the scratched cornea vision or the bits of broken rock and glass that filled your mouth. None of that mattered. A great fatigue had arrived, and it sat you down. I was raised in a very conventional Christian religious family, and you sort of started Sunday school as soon as you could toddle. And if you were a singer, which I am, you sang in the choir forever. And I stayed a long time, and I liked the church. And I liked the building and I loved the choir teacher and I definitely wanted to be part of that. So when it came time for me to go to confirmation class, I really went willingly and tried. And at the end of confirmation class, I didn't feel able to be confirmed. So they said, okay, take it again. So I took confirmation class again willingly. And at the end, I'm a 14-year-old saying to the grown-up world, I'm sorry, I can't do this. So the minister drove to my parents' house and told them I was an atheist, big word, Spillings, Montana. I don't know what that's even about. So I felt that was an overly simplistic and unfair way to categorize my spiritual situation. So I wrote myself this poem. This poem is called, it's my last one. It's called Atheist. Dear universe, is this now? Are you now too? I'm up here in seat 18B, jetting through an obsidian sky. Just one more poet tapping on her laptop, trying to think in the language of insight and surprise. After all these poems, after religion and children, after 2 husbands and some pretty good therapy, you'd think I'd have nailed a few things down. But to quote my computer, this search has produced no results. So tonight, dear heavens, dear mystery, I am reduced to beseeching. O Lord of absence and dark matter, O Master of quarks and these immense, uncountable stars, are we just mice in the garden? Or to put it another way, what is this place? So thank you very much for letting me be part of this reading. I'm going to mute now.
Okay. What a terrific reading. Deborah, your poems are so powerful and so real in the way you read them. I think it's just really terrific too. So thank you for that. And I had read somewhere in my research that you had a series of ekphrastic poems about Lynn's father's artwork. And I'm dying to know, maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A briefly. I'm just kind of curious about how that came about and if you were familiar with his work before you got to know Lynn or the other way around. So anyway, fascinating, but thank you for that wonderful reading. Next, we have Lynn Emanuel. Lynn is the author of 5 books of poetry. The most recent, The Nerve of It, Poems New and Selected, was awarded the Lenore Marshall Prize from the Academy of American Poets. Her work's been featured in Best American Poetry numerous times and has been included in the Oxford Book of American Poetry, the Norton Anthology of Hybrid American Poetry, and published in the New York Times. Among her prizes are multiple fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Poetry Series Award, the Eric Matthieu King Award, also from the Academy of American Poets, and most recently, a fellowship to the Civitella Ranieri Foundation. Her books have been reviewed and or published in poetry, the New York Times Book Review, the Harvard Review, LA Review of Books, Bomb Magazine, and Publishers Weekly. Please join me in welcoming Lynn Emanuel. So happy to have you, Lynn.
I'm delighted to be here, and what a great pleasure it was to hear Deborah Bogen's new poems. I'm delighted to be reading with her on the occasion of the launch of the new Plume 10, and I didn't realize that we are all poets here. And we're surrounding one another. I do want to thank Dr. Hank Hine for making this space, this virtual space connected to the Dalí Museum available to us. And many thanks to Helen Wallace, who did all the work and the negotiation to enable us to read at the poetry at the Dalí. I will just say one small thing about Dani Lawless. Several months ago, I was Zooming with a friend of mine, and I said to her, yes, and I'm going to have a poem in Plum 10. And she said to me, you're going to what? And this is a kind of confession to myself and to Dani, because I think calling plume poetry plum poetry is an apt and happy mistake. Under Dani's editorship, every volume is just bursting with plums. These anthologies are books. They are spacious and diverse and brainy. And so, Dani, thank you, one, for supporting my poetry for a number of years. And thank you, two, for choosing us to read at this celebration. And thank you, three, for all the plums. I'm going to read aloud from a new manuscript. Actually, I'm going to weave back and forth between new work and earlier work without, I don't think, remarking on that, the chronology. The new manuscript is Transcript of the Disappearance, Exact and Diminishing. I will just interrupt myself briefly to say I haven't seen the print copy of Deb's new book. I hope she is including the anecdotes. There are no anecdotes here, unfortunately. I'm just going to be reading pretty much straight through. Bad words. On reading Shipley's Dictionary of Word Origins. Look for neighbor, find sarcophagus. Look for turmeric, find fetus. Look up shape, into which we are licked and knocked tight between the small, the crude, the temporary of shanty, and the notch and nick of shard. Look for trouble, find mob and torch. Look for remorse, find bite and morgue. This poem lent itself to contributing to the title of my new book. It's called The Pandemic Writer. I erased the world so nothing could find it, snuffed out the roses, red and hot as the snouts of bombs, repealed the polar ice cap, even that fat oxymoron, the industrial park, has disappeared. And the last few words huddled together like bees in a hive, buzzing and plotting. I cut their throats with the scythe of a comma, turned the snout of my pen against them. I saved by erasing the streets and the people. Let them be overgrown with absence. I don't care. There is no limit to my appetite, my lust, my zeal for emptiness. But I know you, and you have kept a transcript of the disappearance. A friend of mine said, also during the Zoom conversation, she said, all autobiography is a record of disappearance. This may in fact be a famous quotation that neither of us can find, not even on Google. This poem is Disappearance, Nativity. I was a garden, and you, my gardener. I was a house, and you, my lodger, lodged beneath my heart. My heart, you were the fist that knocked, and I would not answer. You starved me down until a glance could pass straight through me as I lay on the obstetrician's vinyl couch under a shroud that stank of Clorox. They mined for you, their probes slick with the scentless oils of technicians for whom I must be opened, peeled back, forced to look. And I did, as I was told, not relax exactly, but give myself up to your co-conspirators who dug you up out of the blankness of my flesh, parted the dark waters, and suddenly you came forth, a smudge of white against the ultrasound's blackness. You floated spectral, thickly pale, a magnolia in a bowl, an elegant centerpiece. You had no heart, or as minimal as a Mobius strip, but you had style. Even your dying was oddly stylish, the way you resembled more and more each day a comet. The wan tail of you grew longer, more tenuous on the screen. I saw you calmly and with endearing gravity take a nosedive until the light blinked out and I was no longer a house for an uninvited guest, nor a heaven for a gauzy constellation. The screen went dark and I came back to myself. I was no longer a ghost's ghost. I was myself again. I was flesh and living. This poem was in Plume 10, and it has taken on, it is in a rather flippant tone, but it's taken on a somewhat different feeling in the context of the manuscript. Disappearance after 3 weeks at the museum. I saw the figures of the crucifixion in sexual terms. A virgin is weeping. He is asleep, eyes closed, dead to the world. The same old story, mind and body, a marriage on the rocks. He is already dreaming of the great angels of the resurrection, and she is unable to reconcile herself. Who killed him? Somehow she seems implicated simply because he's dead and she is living. Her sorrow illuminates these works, but her lamentation seems almost businesslike, as though she knew all along she would outlive him. You will have to excuse me for a moment while I turn on my timer. Okay. This is undocumented birth, and in the manuscript, it's in italics. It is not the mother who is speaking. It is the child. Undocumented birth. I arrived naked and early to start my life over. There were hallways, there were doors. One hand on a lock unlatched me. One hand was raised to slap me. Gasping and naked on the metal table, I emerged, a diver with a cut hose, pale and gutty from the bloody water. I was not dead. Rising through the atmospheres of sleep, the complaints of sirens. Yes, I remember those small, sharp stars, a sky full of badges. The revolution. Remember, it was early. We were still in the dark slots of our narrow beds, the room twitching and burning from all-night TV, then voices almost lively for this place, I think, unsheathing myself from the damp bedding to the cool and cluttered 8-story commotion, a burn of sound, those voices, a braille of noise. I can't remember what broke that wash of listening, what turned it like a boat steered hard into its own wake, into sight, 1 or 2 floors below us, an answer to your question. You are up and beside me now. What is that? Was dragged by, window, wall, locked in the arms of 2 men and trying to bite her way out of their official embrace. Did I mention leaning out to put ourselves into the courtyard where a spill of images lengthened the view? We stared at a woman in her nightgown, screaming like something metal opening against her will. We saw her, then she was disappeared by wall. We saw her naked feet on the stone. Wind blew this way and that in the immense 8-storied square. And these 2 facts. Her gown was torn from her, and we stood staring. What could be done? There had been trouble, we knew, betrayals of the revolution. Who was to say she was innocent? There are 2 geographies that inform this book. One is New York City, and the other I will talk about in a few minutes. So I spent my misspent girlhood in New York. And at that time, this was the late 60s, the lore of New York there are the 2 rivers that make the island. And the lore of New York is that one was a good river and one was a bad river. And the good river was, of course, the Hudson River. In fact, I had a former teacher who did something called ice boating. And he had this small wooden, exquisite sailboat with blades on the bottom. And this was a sport. He wasn't the only one to do this. And so he would skate back and forth across the Hudson, almost, it was like watching a ballet. Then there was the bad river, which was the East River, and went between, and this is where I now have an apartment near the East River. It ran between New York and New Jersey. And that was where the bodies were dumped. My Eurydice, late 1960s, New York City, East River. From Jackson Pollock, I had learned to hate Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. Those white sheets, thrown back covers of the breaker's unmade bed, and Venus, uncombed, unkempt, always just decanted from sleep, that hair, a serpentine peignoir tossed across her shoulders. I scrubbed my palette down to nothing but the colors of wash water and zinc bucket. And I embraced the iron light between Broadway and the Bowery, and beneath the street lights, the junkies, fellow bees in a hive of misery. But I loved my oppression, walked Cherry Street to the docks, and there, washed out, dreamy, creepy, drowned in her last experiment, was a rat, the dry clove of her eye glaring up. If I bent down, I would see into the broken hive of bones. I didn't look at her, staring at me from the window of her underworld. About death, I didn't give a damn. I believed my hand could open any lock. And even if not, as I forged ahead, I did not once look back. This city as afterlife. Across the street, the 14th floor, vacant and pure, dark as the inside of an iris, the condo named Heaven. But who would want to live there in a building named for the repository of vanished things? On 7th, the traffic, loud and stupid as a fist fight, the trucks of intense movers orbit the island, stricken with daylilies, heads bowed, drenching with pollen the ground. And overhead, sudsy clouds and contrails, and suddenly the bud of form loosens. Rain. I live in the capital of sight. Good night, my subjects, I proclaim, each night gazing out at their gold windows from inside my own gold frame of the afterlife, which this place is. Gazing down at the gleaming welter, bus windows, row houses, dead casements. I am in heaven. I don't care that I am dead. But what of my subjects? And what can I turn to when Manhattan ends? Now for a change of place and a bit of a preamble, Deborah noted that I have been always interested and fond of film noir. And aside from all their, noble attributes, what I've always loved about these films is their accuracy. A street, a hotel room in one of these films would fill me with recognition. I know how they smell. And in the middle of writing my book, film noir took me again to a very specific geography. As a child, I spent a considerable amount of time during the 50s living in a small town in Nevada where my grandparents lived and where the atom bomb was being tested in a desert, not far enough away from us to be safe. The middle section of Transcript of the Disappearance is a suite of paragraphs that I hope put that place in place. It is the 50s, the class structure, the bomb, and always by omission, it is race. The town that I lived in was called Ely. The planet Krypton. Outside the window, the McGill smelter sent a red dust down on the smoking yards of copper, on the railroad tracks' frayed ends disappearing into the congestion of the afternoon. Ely lay dull and scuffed, a miner's boot toe worn away, dim, while my mother knelt before the Philco radio to coax the detonation from the static. From the Las Vegas Tonopah artillery and gunnery range, the sound of the atom bomb came biting like a swarm of bees, and we sat in the hot Nevada dark, delighted when the switch was tripped and the bomb hoisted up its silky, hooded, glittering, uncoiling length. It hissed and spit. It sizzled like a poker in a toddy. The bomb was no mind and all body. It sent a fire of static down the spine, and in the dark, it glowed like the coils of an electric stove. It stripped every leaf from every branch until a willow by a creek was a bouquet of switches, flexible, naked, and fine. Bathed in the light of K-Down Las Vegas, my crouched mother looked radioactive, swampy, glaucous, like something from the planet Krypton. In the suave and brilliant wattage of the bomb, we were not poor. In the atom's fizz and pop, we heard possibility uncorked, taffeta wraps whispered on Davenports. A new planet bloomed above us, and in its light, even the stumps of cut pine gleamed like dinner plates. The world was beginning all over again, fresh and hot, and we could have anything we wanted. Sorry. This piece of prose, one of the paragraphs, mentions Eartha Kitt, and the people that I'm reading to this very minute know who she is, but many people no longer know her. And she was an amazing Black singer who from the 50s and 60s and on. And this is called How It Was With Us. All around me are the props of influenza and the 50s. A spoon swollen by the optics of a water glass looms like a planet. The whole room is troubled and elusive, and beyond it, the realm of sleep bristles with symbols. I am a fever in a fever. At night, from the green radiance of our radio, Eartha Kitt's voice, rough and slow, like a prisoner with a wire sawing at an iron bar. And outside, the atom bomb blooms like a giant flower. No, bigger, a whole what? A whole white garden of dust and radiation washes over us, and further off the trucks, each huge like a lit city, boil down I-80 towards the end of the world. My skin is rosy with diseases. My heartbeats come and go like a freshet under ice, unpredictably fast. Then slowly, slowly, I ache through June, where some child's cry clings to the night like a treed cat. Unfortunately, I'm reading through these much faster than I had expected, but this too has no introduction, so it's just called Hello. Hello to the unimaginative and dim ways of my kin. Hello to the bad lot we are, to the women mean and plucked, to the men on the broken steps who beat down the roses with their hosings. Hello to the nights that rose black as an inked plate into which an acid bit stars, puckered, tight, hard, pale as a surgeon's scars. And hello to all our vast, unconditional bad luck, the sensible, the stuffy, the ugly couture of the thrifty. Hello to the limp of bad goods, of old furniture, and the repeated wince of the creaky rockers. And to grandmothers dying in their clutch. And hello to rage, which, like an axis, could move the earth. My life in noir films, they were documentary, an archive. In them, I could behold everything I had beheld, the paranoia, the violence, even the famous visual signatures were not simply a style, they were a record, a mirror of lived experience. My girlhood happened in black and white, and like noir films was dreamy, strange, erotic, ambivalent, and cruel. The title of this sort of sets the scene for this piece, and the title is My Mother's Parents Owned the Collins Hotel on US Route 80 in Ely, Nevada. And I-80 had been described by National Geographic as the loneliest road in America. And that's where my grandparents owned their hotel. As you might imagine, the tenants were not numerous, and they were mostly miners and truckers and other transients. I don't remember, as I say in this piece, I don't really remember any women who stayed there, except for this one woman who I'm about to describe. My mother's parents owned the Collins Hotel on US Route 80 in Ely, Nevada. The lobbies and hallways were tiled with black and white linoleum and lit with dim sconces. Each room contained an iron bedstead, a deal dresser, a sink. The windows were decked out with the same jaundiced blinds that hung in my friend Maria's windows in Denver. I saw this room time and time again at the movies, where the camera seemed to be waiting for me in its emptiness. My mother was out of work, and we were living in one of the hotel's vacancies. There was the whitewashed bedstead with a headboard whose iron bars had a Romanesque curve, a chenille spread nearly bald from my picking out the threads, and a dish filled with pinion nuts on the dresser. I loved the idleness of my life at that time. I was not bothered by having to play with other children. There were no other children. I was deliriously alone and surrounded by adults. I would follow the maid on her rounds, trailing from room to room, a small and avid voyeur with a shaky handheld camera of my attentiveness. Aside from my grandmother, my mother, and the maid, I saw no women at the hotel, except for one. In her room, over the end of her unmade bed, hung a battered pair of white underpants, its core stained a deep red. The image was biblical, a shroud with a bloody mark, and the odor of the body was powerful. The maid opened a window, swabbed out the sink, and left. I was impressed by the way the room seemed untouchable, the way I would later feel seeing the dioramas at the Museum of Natural History. And the next day, I saw that woman wearing men's khaki pants and a flannel shirt, standing in the lobby with my grandfather, who was dropping quarters into her outstretched hand. After that, the window closes forever. And I'd like to finish with this poem, which also happens in a desert, although a very different desert. And I hadn't made this connection until Deborah's reading, but it is also about a box. It's a poem based on an archaeological excavation that I participated in, and I will say the I in this, the narrator of this poem, is the buried woman, and the she is the woman excavating her. The dig. Beyond the dark souks of the old city, beyond the dome of the rock, gray and humped and haunted, beyond the eyes of the men at the cafe, where they drink their thimbles full of hot tea, beyond the valley with its scar of naked pipe, the perfect geometrical arcs of irrigation, and someone incising a dark furrow in a field, some plowman's black gutter opening through the green. She is waist deep in my open grave, staring at the delicate puzzle of my feet. Beyond her, in the shadow of Tel El Hesse, dabbing and dampening the earth, another woman finds the faint brickwork of floors spidering the dust. On the hearth's wedge-shaped arc of shadow, a scattering of charred millet, and nothing else for miles. Nothing but this bluff of ruin, one decapitated tower, one window staved into the brick, and the bougainvillea crawling across a wall, dragging its little bloody rags. She is standing here thinking she cannot bear the way this foot, my foot, wants to step out of the earth. I don't care. I am using her to leave the grave. And so we go on. We go on until we cannot go on, deepening my grave. And the trowel hits stone, and I lie staring while she makes the earth recede, reaches in and pulls me out. My jaw wired shut by roots, my skull so full of dirt that suddenly the intricate sutures come loose, and in her hands, the whole head opens. In the shallow setting where I lay is the small triangular sail of my scapula, my ribs like the grill of a car. She bones me like a fish, lays the little pieces, the puzzling odds and ends into the dishes of shellac and formalin. One finger still wears the faint blue stain of a ring. Wearily, I lean my reassembled head, sutures rich with glue, against the wall of the filled beaker, a fine sweat of bubbles on my chin. All night, through the window of my jar, I watch her mend with glue and wire the shallow saucer of my pelvis. We are nothing, she and I, earth, staring at earth. Thank you.
Wow. What a terrific reading. Boy, between the two of you, all of the rich imagery and use of metaphor, just really, really striking. And
I didn't notice any metaphors, but there were some real actualities in there. Lynn, I have to say, I stayed in a motel. I don't remember the name of it, in Ely, Nevada. And I realized how far from God some places are. I also realized for the first time there why the state bird of Nevada is actually the bat.
Oh, that I didn't know. Oh my
Well,
God.
I'm not sure it's true, but it seemed appropriate.
It should be true.
It should be true, exactly. I just have to say, as a response to that, that I can't tell you how many times after reading this poem and after these poems and mentioning Ely, people come up to me after the reading and say, "Oh no, I've been there."
Oh, interesting. Wow.
It's very strange and very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. How many years did you live there, Lynn?
I can't say. I don't really know, because it was always during the summer and visiting. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know how many years altogether it went on.
Well, terrific reading from both of you. And we will segue now into our Q&A. We've got we can go on a little bit longer if that works okay for the two of you, since we had to start a little bit late, unfortunately, because of my situation. I'd love to start, Hank, unless you have a question you'd like to start with. I've got one that I can
Please begin.
ask. Okay, I'd love to hear both of you talk a little bit about clearly the use of striking imagery and metaphor. Can you talk a little bit about what you think makes a good poem, the components of a good poem that you find compelling, and so what you strive for as a writer and what you enjoy reading when you look at poems? Do you want to start us out, Deborah?
Okay, let's see. I have a little, so I guess there's two things that come immediately to mind, which is, in many ways, I think of myself as a collagist at this point in time. So I'm always collecting material, and I'm a big thief. If I hear a phrase on TV, if something gets said on the radio, if I'm sitting by someone on the bus, they say something I think is cool. Like, I have my electrical device sending me that in a note. So I'm a thief. I would say that. I'm a little magpie about that. And the other thing is, so the poems in this manuscript, Jacar has a really great designer who has designed the book for me better than I did myself, actually. But the poems are all in the shape of a box. Every poem is a box. So not exactly like a prose poem because they actually are in a box. And so I was always asking myself, what belongs in this box? And it became like a Cornell guardian angel for me. I'm making this box. What belongs in this box? And so you have to have a balance of flat out information and ways to make that information be vital and striking. Okay, that's enough for me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Lynn.
So, this is the hardest question in the world to answer.
That's why I'm
Thank
asking
you
it.
so much. Well, it's interesting. And I might, it was, my father was a visual artist. He was a painter and a sculptor. His name is Akiba Emanuel, and he now has a website. But I grew up in an artist studio. I mean, yeah. And I would look at these paintings, and my incoherence helped me because I would see a painting and all I could think about was, I want to eat that color, that purple right there. I want to eat it. It was so delicious and deep and glossy and whatever. So image has clearly always been, extremely important to me. And so has sound. I really, what I love about Deborah's work is that these are boxes, but they are musical boxes. They aren't, the sort of avant-garde right now is writing more poems that eschew the kind of melodic element, which I also respect. But for me, the sound and the image is, really important. And so is, especially recently, I'm very interested in class, the way it infiltrates poems, even if the poet is not maybe aware of it. So one of my favorite books is Pavesi's Hard Labor, which ticks all the boxes. It's fantastically written, but it feels like it's just coming out of the earth like a growth of some kind, because it's saturated with a certain landscape in Italy and the people who are there. And yeah, that's my answer.
And I was reading that you, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have some new poems that you refer to as the dog poems.
Oh, those were earlier poems, and those were absolutely about underdogs. Yeah.
Okay, underdog. I was getting a real sense of class as I was reading those poems, not only in what you said, but also the way in which you put your words together and the sort of slang that you brought in. And I don't know, I felt like you were doing it syntactically as well as the content of the poems, which was very interesting to me. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hank, would you have anything you'd like to add about that for your own poems?
Well, no, not at all. I do have a question though, because we're so concerned. So I've heard the magpie habit and the role of visual art in these in formulating these poems by these two great poets. I'm wondering also about dream, because we're very obsessed with dream here right now, preparing an exhibition on how painters depict dreams. One thinks of Chagall immediately with dream, but it's a persistent theme, particularly in embracing mythology. So is there anything of dream in your poetic process, I guess is my question.
I really think, Deb, you should answer this.
Okay. So in my poetic process, I always love that kind of phrase because I don't actually feel like I have one, but dreams are a big deal. It's not even that I remember particular dreams, it's the state of going into the dream state. So when I say the dream blood was your blood, it's because I think for both Lynn and I, the world is equally populated with the dead and the living. Just because people are dead doesn't mean they go away. They refuse to. So you have to have them in some relationship to your everyday life that you're living now. And in my view, it comes under a sort of dream imagery. And I actually looked up Paul Eluard when I looked at your site. And I'm probably not saying that last name right. But one of the things my husband and I noticed as we are older is the sleep life becomes very significant. And it's a place of communion and relationship, even as we're sleeping. I feel now that we're in some kind of dream relationship there too. So it's bound to get into the work because you might want to say I'm less conscious than I used to be as a younger woman, but you know, the dream world has to be there as a way to hold significant things I think about the world, about humans. And I agree to bring in myth. Myth is to bring in our joined history, I think, or the history that we share. And so there has to be a way to hold that. And the New York Times is not going to hold it for me. So I have to hold it in the poem.
So there's a dreams, I guess the dream space is one that doesn't make distinctions like we do in waking life between alive and not alive, because
Exactly.
everything we've experienced is alive equally.
Yeah. Yeah. Lynn, would you like to add anything to that with respect to dreams and your work?
I really, I was trying to think because I really have not written from dreams, except the waking dreams of memory, maybe. Memory seems to happen to me in a very uncommon way. It happens filled with images and sound. But yeah, I've never managed to write from that, that the thickness of dreams.
It's interesting you mentioned use the term waking dreams, and I'm just now writing about a painting of Philip Guston's. It's called Daydream, and in it there's this hooded figure smoking a cigar and a kind of thought bubble like the late Guston, very cartoonish, like with objects that might have a kind of a violent association, a cleaver, a brick, shoes in the sense of the death camps, or and the only way to understand this, that Philip Guston is part of that Ashcan school and was very socially active through the 30s, who's part of the WPA, always socially engaged. And here he is in the 1970s, identifying with this figure, this hooded figure. And so one wonders, how is that possible? And one of the things that we've learned about dreams is that the prefrontal cortex and its reason is suspended in dreams. So there are other things, the amygdala, the memories in the hippocampus, all these other areas are very active. But in a daydream, you have both those emotion and memory sections active, but the whole idea of rational thought and moral censure is also awake during daydreams. And so they're really qualitatively different from dreams. And in a sense, they can explain why in daydreams we do hold ourselves accountable for our thoughts or our daydreams in the way we don't in our dreams.
That's
we
really
until we wait?
interesting. That's really interesting. And I had the occasion when I was in or graduate school. Adrienne Rich was one of my teachers, and I think this is somewhere in one of her poems. But the sort of gross way to say this is she said, "Don't follow your dreams, follow your daydreams," because they were so focused on one's desires.
Interesting. Yeah. I was thinking, though, in some ways, Lynn, about some of your poems that I read. You allow yourself, and I think I read a little bit about this in your book, The Nerve of It, a kind of fluidity that comes into your use of syntax. And I'm thinking I guess I'm asking a question, if sometimes even the craft, the way we put our poems together, the language we choose, the words we use, the imagery that surfaces, puts us in touch with that sort of dreamlike quality without even necessarily recognizing it as the context of the poem or the content of the poem. And I was reading about how, in the way you put that book together, you allowed yourself to kind of leap in time and put older poems with newer poems. And I don't know, it seemed to me that you were almost sort of embracing a more dreamlike, I would say, syntactical quality and putting the book together, if not in the content of the poems. So
yeah. I think that's actually right, although I had not thought of that. And I think what I was most interested in was creating a book that wasn't linear.
Right.
As
that's what I mean. Yeah.
Volumes that I've published, I think, have been. And so suddenly I found there was one section of the New and Selected that are all about death, dying, and burial. And that hadn't ever reached my consciousness as a theme, not just a theme, but an obsession. And it was so interesting to me that it was in different ways, in different volumes. And yet,
that's exactly what I'm talking about, a sort of fluidity that almost becomes dreamlike in a sense. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. You both, correct me if I'm wrong, but you both have explored the use of hybrids a lot in your poems. Deborah, your most recent book, that's the boxes you're talking about.
No, the most recent book is prose poems, but they're not
prose poems. Okay.
Poems. Yeah, I
got
not blocks,
more extreme. And would you call them where are they sort of prose poems, but also hybrids in some ways? And if you would both talk a little bit about the use of hybrids.
Honestly, I don't even actually know what hybrid is. So, I mean, except that you think about, maybe some lineated work. What happened to me, quite honestly, was I started writing prose poems after 2 books of writing lineated poems because I stopped having the line breaks matter. Not that they're bad or good, just in my head, in myself as a writer, I couldn't make the line breaks matter the way they had. Okay. So I thought, I'm just going to write them. I'm going to write the prose and see if in the prose poem I could put enough music, as Lynn would say, and enough interesting juxtapositions that this has some of the other attributes of poetry, even though it's in this form. So that's what happened. And then I think almost the box poems became, they grew out of that, but they became quite obsessive. Believe it or not, I didn't read you all the box poems I have in this manuscript. I thought I'll scare these people off, but the box became a really, really interesting toy. And kind of a scary, interesting toy. So that's what happened for me. I didn't consciously think about it in any other way. I would say, for one thing, I'm not trained. So most of what I figured out how to do, I've been stumbling along with a lot of help from other people, but I didn't ever go to an MFA program. I'm not as well read as I wish I was. And in consequence, sometimes I feel like the work's running me and I'm trying to keep up. And why anyone would want to write in boxes, I don't know that I could defend that. It just came upon me.
But in a way, how wonderful to have the work be running you. I mean, that sounds great to me, to have a poem that carries itself that way and you go with it. I think that sounds great. Yeah. Yeah. Lynn, now do you play around some with hybrids, meaning it's some kind of cross between poetry and prose, that maybe when you sit down to write it, you're not quite sure which it's going to be, or do you typically find that you lineate your poems?
No, I'm a very cranky purist. And I think, let's see, why is that? I think because the term prose poetry at a certain moment, and I think we're past that moment, thank God, covered everything. It covered everything. There was, anything that didn't have a line break at a certain place was a prose poem.
Right.
And, I mean, I read Baudelaire, and I mean, the prose poem has a history, and it's also a history of the way you work with, the real and dream. And it started, I hated when everything was called a prose poem, because it began to lose its punch, its meaning. It began to be, sort of anonymous and floating. So I am very strict about my poems. They look like poems, and the new prose I'm writing, they're not prose poems. They're prose. They're paragraphs.
Nice.
Yeah. And I insist on that divide, because it's more interesting to have two things in the world than it is paragraphs and then prose poems as, they come with their dreams and all their history, than to just call everything that looks a certain way a prose poem.
I just would add,
interesting,
to argue a little bit here. I just do think that the one thing I always say to younger writers who ask me things is, I say, the bottom line rule is there's not one way to do it.
Right.
And no one can tell you that. So the bottom line is, do I still want to keep reading? If you're writing something really compelling, then you're going to get a lot of room for me. And if you really want to call it a prose poem, I'm going to probably be okay with that if I can't stop reading it, if it's so good.
Right.
So, I just do think there's, like, you could look at Francis Ponge and you could look at Baudelaire. You could say prose poems for both of those, but they're nothing alike.
Right.
Those are two totally different ways to do it. So, so I actually think maybe more than the form, I'm interested in looking at the artistry. And I would think where Lynn and I have an overlap, and why we can work together, I think, is, bottom line, we have a lot of concern with art and a lot of concern with death and a lot of concern with what can art do, and then also with what can art not do. So I will misquote this, Lynn, and maybe you can do it perfectly, but one of Lynn's poems that immediately got me interested in her was the one that says, despite my lovely diction, I will die alone on a steel bed in my stocking feet. And I thought, well, isn't that true? We can be as fancy as we want to be. And in the end, each of us has this moment. So it's been interesting to me to look at her work as, you can do fantastic things with all this art. And then there's a moment where, what can you do? She's lying in the grave. You see her foot. It's unnerving.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good antidote to what I said. That, Ponge writes prose poems, Baudelaire writes prose poems. They are different, but they are different. And but they each, Baudelaire was, driving himself past formal French poetry, and Ponge was writing, not all the time, but a good, many of his poems during the occupation of France. So there was, there's a codedness in Ponge that if you understand that, like he has a poem about a crate that is torn apart on the street. And this is a ridiculous, I mean, it's nothing like that, but this crate and all, if you know about what he's encountering, he was an editor during that time. You understand that prose poem that he's writing as having to be necessary in that form, just as Baudelaire was necessary in his form. Mm-hmm. And that's the only, there was just a moment when I felt, and not any, and not anymore. And Deb, actually, before we came on the air, I had asked her about the difference between the box and the prose poem. And she had very interesting things to say about that, including the difference in subject matter for each one. But I think there was a time when there seemed to be, a kind of, people had inherited something that looked like this and anything could go into it. And that's when I got cranky.
That's when you stand guard with the lineation. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Hank, would you like to ask anything or add?
No, I found the conversation delightful, and the rapport that you two have is also really charming.
Yeah, it is. Do you have questions for each other? Did you happen to have a question you'd like to ask each other, or have we covered it, do you think?
I think we've covered a lot of our questions.
No, I was just
Deb is leaning forward.
I'm thinking, hey, Lynn, can we have coffee next week? That's my question.
Right. Well, it has been delightful to have both of you join us in the Dalí Poetry Series. And I'm a big fan of your work. And thank you for being here as part of it. Hank, I'm so glad you were able to join us today. We know how busy you stay at the museum.
Thank you so much. It's been delightful.
Okay, well, thank you. It was wonderful to meet you all. Now I have to get down to the museum.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And let us know when you're down this way.
Okay.
We would love to have you come.
Please do. We would love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you again. And all right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.